That was the beginning of Untitled Original by the New York Art Quartet, released on the ESP disc label in 1965. The original lineup featured John Chikai on alto saxophone, Lewis Worrell on bass, Milford Graves on drums, and Roswell Rudd on trombone. And Roswell Rudd is the subject of this episode of the Burning Ambulance podcast. Hello, I'm Phil Freeman, and thanks for listening. If you're hearing this podcast for the first time, this is episode 4, and you can catch up and subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, and other podcast platforms. And if you've been with us all along, welcome back. Roswell Rudd is an extremely important figure in avant-garde jazz. His discography goes all the way back to the beginning. He just turned 82 last week, the week we taped this interview. He was born November 17, 1935, in Connecticut. He started out playing the French horn, but around high school he switched to the trombone, and while he was attending Yale, he joined a Dixieland band called Eli's Chosen Six, who can be seen in the movie Jazz on a Summer's Day from 1958, playing while driving around in a convertible. Not long after that, Rudd moved to New York and got involved with players like Archie Shepp, Steve Lacy, and Cecil Taylor. He was part of the 1961 sessions Taylor did for the Candid label. You can hear him on the Cell Walk for Celeste, Jumpin' Pumpkins, and New York City R&B albums. Rudd and Lacy collaborated for several years in the early 60s, performing Thelonious Monk's music. He was also in Shepp's band for several years, playing on records like 4 for Train, Live in San Francisco, and Mama Too Tight. He's on Carla Bley's Escalator Over the Hill. He's on Communications by the Jazz Composers Orchestra. He's on the first Liberation Music Orchestra album. He's on New York Eye and Ear Control with Albert Ayler, Don Cherry, John Chikai, Gary Peacock, and Sonny Murray. And of course, he's recorded dozens of albums as a leader. His newest album, Embrace, is a collection of jazz standards, performed with singer Faye Victor, pianist Lafayette Harris, and bassist Ken Filiano, and no drummer. But last year, he released Strength and Power, an album of total improvisation with Jamie Saft on keyboards, Trevor Dunn on bass, and Balaz Pandey on drums, all of whom are significantly younger than himself. This is important, and this interview is important because Roswell Rudd was diagnosed with cancer in 2013 and has been fighting it ever since. So when you listen to this interview, you're going to hear him talking slowly and maybe with a little less energy than some of the other people I've spoken to. You're also going to hear me get the name of Embrace wrong early on. I call it Tenderness, and he corrects me. But anyway, he's still out there. He's still making music whenever he can, and he's got a lot of insight and a lot of stories to share. So here's a portion of the song I Look in the Mirror, which is from Embrace and was written by Roswell Rudd's longtime partner, Verna Gillis. And right after that, you'll hear our conversation.
reminds me of me. I'm not as I was, I am as I am. It's all about acceptance, the best that I can. For many of us, it's the second time around. We lost who we've lost, we found who we found. Love and hope spring eternal as we go around. The comforts we find in each other abound. It is what it is, it's not what it's not. Oh, just to be grateful for all that I got.
What initially drew you to the trombone, and how old were you when you started to play?
I began playing French horn in the regional high school band in Clinton, New York. And it was the first time I'd ever played a horn, and I just loved it. And I was playing with the high school's symphonic regional band.
Uh-huh.
And there were, I guess, probably eight French horn players, but we all were at least one person knew how to read. So this was a way of learning, which I felt was very effective, and I was able to use my eyes as well as my ears.
Mm-hmm.
So, unfortunately, we moved away from Clinton. But before we did, I wanted to try to play like to some of the trombone players on my dad's records, so that I would be able to play along with him.
Okay.
He was a great amateur drummer.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And so I said, with the next person going to Utica, please go to a pawn shop and bring back a trombone, because I can't find any French horn players on these records. And that's what I need, a trombone, in order, to go along with the masters on the 20s, 30s, and 40s jazz records.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I got to play the trombone.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I remember speaking to, do you know Brother Ah in Washington, D.C.? He's a French horn player who did a bunch of stuff. He was on John Coltrane's Africa Brass record, I believe, and a bunch of other records in the 50s and 60s. And that was one of the things that we talked about, was the difficulty of finding a place for the French horn in jazz.
Yeah. Well, that was the same thing I was facing. But trombone seemed to have the nearest sound. And there were plenty of trombone players on the records.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The real masters.
Yeah, yeah.
So I began learning with the best.
Mm-hmm. So you learned primarily from records early on?
Yeah, that's how I started. Through the French horn, I had learned something about, uh, writing horn notation
Uh-huh.
and, moving through the keys.
At what point did you decide that you were going to be a professional musician? And have you always made a living playing, or did you have non-music jobs and stuff like that?
Well, actually, I think it began when I was in college. There were two or three people that I knew who were already a class ahead of me, who had put together a Dixieland band, called it Eli's Chosen Six, and I was able to get out on the weekends with them. And between that and a scholarship job, put myself through school for 4 years. Pretty good.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
After Eli's Chosen Six, I went down to New York permanently.
Mm-hmm.
Found myself a loft, lower Broad Street, and began jamming with the likes of Archie Shepp and Herbie Nichols and people who were looking for a place to play their music.
Yeah, I was curious when and how you first got together with Archie Shepp. Was it the Cecil Taylor sessions in 1961, or was it before that? Did you know him before that?
It was before that. I can't tell you exactly when, but it was before 1960.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how did you guys get together with Cecil and start working with him?
Well, we all got together to do various projects. And, in fact, Cecil invited me to play on one of his. That was a great honor. And I worked with Archie on a project and wrote some arrangements along with him.
Mm-hmm.
And that got recorded.
Mm-hmm.
By that time, it was 1962, right in there.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. And then you started working with Steve Lacy around that time too, early 1960s. So when you started working with Lacy, what was the challenge to you of interpreting, because a lot of the work that you did was Thelonious Monk pieces, so what was the challenge of interpreting those without piano?
Well, first of all, great music. And Steve very determined, and myself very determined. And he had been into it a couple of years already, and I was just getting started. So for me, it was a great experience learning the songs. And then I had more and more reason to get out and hear Thelonious Monk playing at the 5-Spot and the other places around the East Village
Mm-hmm.
where he performed.
Yeah, yeah.
So I was working both ends of it that way, the recorded end and the live end.
Now, was he aware of you guys' work doing his music?
I think Steve may have told him about us.
But did you ever, you never spoke to him about it or anything like that?
I never did
Uh-huh.
anything but thank him
Mm-hmm.
for what he had given to the world. But, yeah, I think Steve introduced me once and mentioned what our project was.
What,
and that went on for a couple of years.
Yeah, yeah. And what Tell me about from a player's standpoint, the relationship that you hear between the soprano sax and the trombone, how they work together.
Well, I think that the soprano sax has the power of a brass instrument, and I was careful, to make sure that we had the right intensity with each other, especially when playing the songs. And, just something you have to work out.
Mm-hmm.
But the trombone has that extra octave and a half below the soprano, and, can blast.
Yeah, yeah.
And occasionally you want that for a minute. The rest of the time we try to play in a balanced way.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. You've also recorded with Steve Swell in a quartet, so that was 2 trombones, bass, and drums. So what was that like in terms of arranging tunes and musical language and stuff like that?
Well, Steve has been my brother on the trombone, and this may have been a start of what I call the trombone tribe, and it was rewarding, really, to be able to do trombone records, starting with that one.
Mm-hmm. How do you, when you've got 2 of the same instrument, particularly a trombone, which has a very, sort of unique and very full voice, like you were saying, how do you stay out of each other's way?
Good question. We really have to open up our ears and remind ourselves. I can't tell you more than that. And sometimes it takes a while.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
But I think we got there.
Yeah, yeah. Now, your first album the first Archie Shepp record that you played on was 4 for Train in '64, and John Chakai is also on that. Did you and he form the New York Art Quartet after that, or did that group already exist?
That's all about the same time.
Uh-huh. So it was kind of everything
Actually,
happening at once?
New York Art Quartet was a little bit before.
Mm-hmm. And
a lot of rehearsing going on up in my loft with the New York Art Quartet and with Archie for the what was that label with Bob's Impulse, and the rehearsing for the Impulse tracks.
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, I remember I interviewed Archie once, and he was talking about how Bob actually brought Coltrane down to the session to hear the music. So were you around when that happened?
Yes, I was.
And
that was a great moment.
Had you met Coltrane before that?
I don't know if I had. If I did, it was at the Half Note, which is about 10 blocks above where I lived in Soho.
Uh-huh.
And I mean Soho. So I got to know him there because he played there pretty regularly. And, but of course, to have him come and sitting with us and listening to the playbacks, that was a rare treat.
Mm-hmm. What were you going for with the New York Art Quartet in terms of being different from what else was going on in jazz at that time?
Well, I think the personalities were the things we wanted to bring out, namely Milford Graves, myself, and John Shikai, and a number of great bass players. But there was a lot of personality just with John, myself, and Milford.
Mm-hmm.
And anything that we might compose, it should be about us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you think that it was the strength of the personalities of the three of you that was the reason you had so many bass players?
No, it was probably the fact that there wasn't that much work, and if there was a job coming up, not much notice, we would just take whoever was available.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
And we got some good bass players that way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What are your memories of the New York Eye and Ear Control session? Was that your first time playing with Albert Eiler?
New York Eye and Ear Control. Michael from Canada.
Yeah, it was a movie director, and you guys did like a score for the movie.
Well, that was a great occasion. You know, I think I had heard Albert briefly somewhere before that, but that was a great band. Gee. And Michael described what he'd like, kind of talking about things that he envisioned in the film. And then we weren't looking at film when we played, but we were kind of playing along the lines of what Michael described. Oh, that was something else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Was that the first time you had done something like that, like improvising, to a concept rather than
film score?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was first time.
Or just doing complete improvisation without even like a head or something to work with.
Yeah, that was the first time. That was a rare treat, and of course with the other players.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm curious because you worked with Archie, you worked with all these other sort of free jazz guys, and in about 69, 70, everybody kind of disappeared over to France, or a lot of people kind of disappeared over to France. Did you take part in that? And if so, or if not, why did you stick around in America when a lot of other guys were sort of disappearing?
Well, I had my chance with John Shikai to go to Denmark for life with my family if I wanted to. But I was for sticking it out in America. And let's see, 69, 70, I think I may have moved uptown. I was working on and off for Alan Lomax, analyzing world folk music.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And, occasionally there would be a music job.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
But by 76, I was out in New York.
Moved upstate?
I went to teach in Maine.
Oh, okay. And what were you teaching music or teaching, ethnomusicology or, something different? What were you working on in Maine?
Jazz.
Uh-huh.
They wanted to learn jazz.
So you were like leading a student ensemble or
Yes,
stuff?
a student ensemble every Tuesday night, and the rest of the time individual lessons, and also a student, I guess it was a sextet that I put together for myself to play around locally from time to time. And actually, we went to New York and played a couple of times.
Nice.
Very exciting for all of us.
Yeah, yeah. Now, I spotted this album that you made in '81, an album called Interpretations of Monk, and it was you and Lacey, but there were also Ben Riley and Charlie Rouse who'd actually been in Monk's bands in the early '60s. So,
Hmm.
what was that like? How did your interpretations of the tunes work together with theirs?
Charlie Rouse. Oh, Interpretations of Monk,
Yeah.
produced by Verna Gillis.
Yes.
Also included Don Cherry.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
Hmm.
So how did you guys sort of get together on like this is our version of Monk versus their version of Monk having?
Well, I came down to New York City from Maine and spent a day rehearsing with everybody, and it was really exciting. Boy, all those great piano players. I think four different piano players on there,
Mm-hmm.
two different drummers. Oh, the best! Wow. Yeah, we decided each of us decided what we'd like to be featured on, but and we picked out a repertory, and we ran it
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And
all in one afternoon and one evening.
so what was it like to play with a guy like Ben Riley, a drummer like that? What was your what kind of a feel did he have that worked for you?
Oh, because he played the songs, and that's what pulled us all together. We knew those songs,
Mm-hmm.
and Riley, especially good ears, was a perfect accompanist in that situation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now you mentioned Herbie Nichols earlier, and
Yeah.
you recorded 2 CDs of his compositions in the '90s. What about his tunes inspired you? What did you pull out of those?
Well, Herbie wrote a lot of songs before he left us, and some I have on manuscript, and you can still get those Blue Note trios, and I think there's one other album. I remember Charlie Mingus saying that he helped Herbie get on on that label. I can't remember exactly what it was, or if I have it, but he left plenty of compositions behind, and his improvisations on those things, and always so much suggestion in his playing for further discovery of what he composed. And Buell Neidlinger has gone down that trail of taking advantage of what Herbie left and moving it ahead
Uh-huh.
his own way.
Yeah.
I don't know anybody else who has. I know a few piano players who wanted to learn his compositions and, the voicings and so forth,
Mm-hmm.
but never took it to where they put together a band and do it that way.
Yeah. Yeah. You've also done some stuff that I would say might fall under the heading of world music as much as jazz. For example, you did that record with the Mongolian Buryat Band, And
I was listening to that the other night.
oh yeah.
Yeah, and I couldn't believe the sound.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then you also did that album with Yomo Toro, who I mostly know from like salsa records.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, yeah, tell me a little bit about those records, like what inspired those projects and things like that. How?
Well, first of all, they never would have happened without Verna Gillis, who got me over to Russia and Mongolia back back at that time.
Uh-huh.
And as soon as I started to play with those folks, the sounds blended in such a way that suggested more music. It was really wonderful. I could get my plunger out and blend with those voices
Uh-huh.
in a way that I'd never had been able to, except maybe with Sheila Jordan. And eventually they came over here, and we did a tour across North America, and that was pretty exciting. They came over here, and we were able to do some things here, and it was very exciting for them. But I'll never forget that first time we played together in Mongolia.
And what about the record with Yomo? How did that one come together? Was that another thing that Verna was helping you out with?
Yeah, she had been producing some of the concerts that Yomo had done in previous times, previous years, and she thought we would be a good match. Boy, he's one of the greatest musicians I ever played with, because when he eventually learned a piece, if he didn't already know it, he would lock it in a way that I'd never heard anybody do it. He found a way to play it, and it was just right for his instrument. And of course, he's a wonderful soloist and improviser. Boy, that was a treat.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said to you, I know his work mostly from salsa records, because he was part of the Fania All Stars, I believe, and the trombone sound on like a Willie Colon record is very different from a jazz trombone sound. I mean, do you ever pull from other genres and say, can I figure out how to get those effects and how to get that sort of big brassy sort of sound, stuff like that?
I'll have to think on that one. I know that a lot of the older jazz musicians, I know that I still draw on their sound. And, the sound, sound shaping.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't hear much trombone playing in the East when I went with Verna a couple of times into China, and worked our way back through Europe again. But some great trombonists in Europe, of course.
Yeah, because it's always been interesting to me, for example, with the trumpet, how different it sounds in a jazz context versus how it sounds in, let's say, a mariachi band. They have that big, brassy, chrome sound.
Well, I think that was carved out in Spain and in the Spanish colonies years ago. That's some pretty old music, and it's very well shaped. And that's what the people wanted to hear from the beginning
Mm.
was a lead like that,
Yeah.
a real brass voice, and then you could put anything around that. Wow, what a great tradition.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just trying to think if I ever heard any of that besides what I heard in New York City
Mm.
coming up.
Yeah. I'm also curious about some of the, because over the past 10 years or so, you've done a few records, a few years apart, but there are these like soft kind of ballady records. You did Keep Your Heart Right, and you did the one August Love Song, and now your new one, Tenderness, is also in this sort of same area, I feel like. So what's
What was the new one you named?
Tenderness, the one with Faye Victor?
Yeah, that's called Embrace.
Embrace, I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what's the appeal of that sort of ballad style for you, particularly the drumless aspect of it?
That's a good question. Finding three other musicians who I could pull together from time to time and just play with and see what happens. These are the songs that developed out of that situation. And we were able to find each other in these songs, in these structures. So you hear the musical personality of the whole band, plus the individual musical personalities. And the beauty of having that is that it's changing all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody can relate to the changes.
So you think it has more of an organic kind of a flow because it's not being driven from behind by the kit?
Well, I think the logistically is the word that I would use to describe the getting together.
Uh-huh.
And, it was up here in Cohocton, New York, and down in Brooklyn, New York, and New York, New York, that we were able to have the musical hangs that brought about this album.
It's funny because you've kind of mentioned that a couple of times, the logistical side of it, because that was the same thing that you were saying was true with the New York Art Quartet, that it was in large part a question of who was around.
That's right.
So how many musical situations do you think you've been in over the course of your career based entirely on you being the guy that was around?
Well, I'd have to say at least 25. Offhand, I wouldn't be able to. If you wanted a better figure, I'd have to sit down and count it out.
Uh-huh.
But through the kindness and generosity of other musicians, I was able to have jam sessions and find other players that way.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. And I feel like when I look at the sort of the full scope of your career, because I look online and I can find well over 100 records that you've been on. And they're so different in terms of different situations and different personnel and stuff like that. It really does seem like you're up for just about anything.
It's still true. Let the world know.
It's and I mean, some of the things that I find that you've done are sort of unusual for a trombone player. Like, you've done 3 albums where you're the only horn backing a female singer. So, I mean, where does that, what do you think makes that work?
Listening closely, and as you said earlier, finding a tone or matching a tone to the singer. You know, it's difficult with a horn like trombone, and you know, being up next to a singer, you really have to be careful and know the singer's style to avoid the, you know, those pitfalls with the overplay and blotting out and so forth.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And they're all very different singers, so it's not like you can come to the second album and go, well, I tried this before and it worked with her, so it'll work with this other woman as well. You know, you can't.
No, I need to spend time with whoever it is, and that's the beauty of Embrace. We had spent time together, at least 4 or 5 years.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Just hanging out and coming across the repertory, part of which is on the album, of songs that we could all find ourselves in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And a lot of them are old songs. I mean, are you still drawn to music from like when you were a kid in the 30s and 40s?
Yeah, I soaked up a lot of music in those years because my father had those 78s on and drumming to them every day from the time I was born. And yes, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
In my case, and with some of the other musicians too.
Yeah, yeah. Now, there's another record that you made last year, or that came out last year, Strength and Power, which was made with Jamie Saft and Vilas Pandey, and those guys, I think, are about half your age, the three of them. So what did you get from them, and what do you think they brought out of you? And I'm particularly interested in Balaz, the drummer, because he comes from a metal background, rather than jazz. So I'm curious what that session was like.
Well, that session was about listening to each other, which is something you have to do in any situation, but especially this one, because I did not know the other musicians playing.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that really exciting.
But they all had approached you, like I'm assuming Jamie, the keyboard player, approached you?
Jamie approached me.
Mm-hmm. And just said, I'd like to make a record with you. What, can you come down on this day? And you guys all just worked from there.
We did it right over in his studio, which is not far from where I live.
Uh-huh.
And all the musicians, or I'll say for sure, the other three musicians had their ears open.
Uh-huh. The last thing I want to ask you about is the song Awesome and Gruesome, because Verna sent me a link to the video, and so I was curious about that, because you've been sick for several years now, but you've continued to work. So how are you doing at the moment?
Well, I'm having good days and not so good days with my health. But I'm doing everything that I can with the help of some doctors to keep myself going.
Yeah. How does it impact your playing? Because I would imagine the trombone is an instrument that requires a degree of stamina.
They all require stamina, but trombone for sure. And always exercised and use the trombone as a form of exercise on my own.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, you need to be in shape to play that thing.
Yeah. Yeah. That was my conversation with Roswell Rudd, and that's the end of this episode of the Burning Ambulance podcast. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll be back for the next one.